A piece of old cloth just did something that police, historians, and true crime writers could not do in over 100 years. It gave a name to Jack the Ripper. Not a guess, not another wild theory pulled from a dusty book. A name, backed by DNA, sitting quietly in a drawer for more than a century while the whole world argued about who the killer really was. And here is the twist that makes this whole story so strange. The man the science points to was never a mystery to the police. He was already written down on their private list back in 1888. Which means the real question is not just who was Jack the Ripper. The real question is, why did the police already know, and why did nothing happen? Let's set the scene first, because you cannot understand how big this moment is without understanding how impossible this case has always been. Autumn of 1888, East London. A part of the city called Whitechapel, a place so poor and so packed with people that entire families lived in a single room, sometimes sleeping in shifts because there was not even enough space for everyone to lie down at once. The streets were narrow, twisting and thick with a kind of fog that locals called a pea souper, a fog so heavy with coal smoke that a person standing a few feet away could look like nothing more than a dark shape. It was the perfect place for someone to disappear the moment a crime was done. Between August and November of that year, 5 women were murdered in that neighborhood in a way that shocked even a city used to poverty and violence. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly. All of them were working-class women struggling to survive, most of them trying to earn just enough coins each night for a bed in a cheap lodging house. None of them were wealthy, none of them were famous, and none of them had any reason to expect that their deaths would still be talked about 137 years later. The killer did not just take their lives. He mutilated their bodies in ways that suggested some knowledge of human anatomy, which is part of why the legend of a surgeon or a doctor grew so strong. The murders were brutal enough and public enough that newspapers turned the case into a sensation almost overnight, and a nickname born from a taunting letter most likely written by a journalist chasing readers rather than the real killer stuck forever. Jack the Ripper. Picture just how thin the line was between the police and the public back then. London in 1888 had roughly 4 million people crammed into it, and Whitechapel alone packed hundreds of thousands into a few square miles of slum housing. Officers patrolling those streets at night had a whistle to call for backup and a wooden club, nothing more. There was no radio, no streetlight on every corner, no way to seal off an area quickly. A killer only had to slip around one corner into the fog and he was gone, swallowed by a maze of courtyards and back alleys that even local constables sometimes struggled to navigate. Against that kind of environment, a murderer did not need to be brilliant. He simply needed to know the streets better than the men chasing him and move fast. The panic that followed each murder was enormous. Vigilante patrols formed. Newspapers ran daily updates that whipped readers into a frenzy, some of them printing wild theories just to sell more copies. The police were flooded with an avalanche of tips, accusations, and letters, many of them fake, some of them cruel pranks, a few of them possibly genuine but impossible to verify with the tools available at the time. Officers had no fingerprint system yet, no blood typing, nothing that could scientifically link a suspect to a crime scene beyond eyewitness testimony, and eyewitnesses in a fog thick enough to hide a person standing a few feet away were never going to be reliable. For well over 100 years after that, this case has lived less like an unsolved crime and more like folklore. Every generation produced a new favorite suspect, a royal insider, a crazed doctor, a famous painter. Some theories even claimed the murders were part of a secret plot to protect the British monarchy from scandal, involving a hidden brotherhood covering up an affair tied to the royal family, with a group of women silenced one by one because they supposedly knew a secret worth protecting at any cost. It sounds like something out of a novel, and that is exactly why people loved it, because the idea that an ordinary unknown man could have done something this horrific and simply walked away felt almost too plain to accept. People wanted their monster to be someone important, someone whose identity would make the horror feel like it meant something bigger than random cruelty aimed at poor women nobody in power cared much about. That hunger for a grander explanation never really went away. Over the decades, authors have pointed fingers at painters, at surgeons, at lawyers, even at members of high society, each new book promising the definitive answer, each one eventually fading into just another theory on a very long shelf. Part of what kept the case alive for so long was exactly that lack of resolution. An unsolved mystery this famous becomes its own kind of entertainment, a puzzle box people enjoy turning over even without expecting it to ever fully open. The truth, as it turns out, may be far more uncomfortable than any of those glamorous theories because it points towards someone almost nobody would have picked if they were writing the story themselves. Scotland Yard at the time had almost nothing to work with. No fingerprint technology yet, no blood typing, no way to test a stain and learn anything beyond the fact that it was, in fact, blood. Detectives were working with witness accounts, a flood of letters from the public, most of them fake and their own instincts. Thousands of names were floated as suspects. Most were dead ends. But behind closed doors, senior police officers quietly built their own short list of the men they actually believed were capable of this, a list that was never fully shared with the public and stayed buried in old case files for generations. Now fast forward to a piece of evidence that almost nobody took seriously for most of the 20th century, a stained silk shawl. According to a story passed down through one family, this shawl was picked up at the scene of the fourth murder, the killing of Catherine Eddowes in a dark corner of London called Mitre Square, on the night of September 30th, 1888. The story goes that a police constable named Amos Simpson found it there and, instead of logging it as evidence the way procedure required, took it home. Maybe he thought his wife would like the fabric. Maybe it was simply a different era, one without evidence bags and chain of custody rules. Whatever the reason, the shawl never made it into any official police report. It just disappeared into a family's possession and stayed there, folded away, handed down through the years like a strange and slightly unwanted heirloom. For decades, that missing paper trail was exactly why serious historians dismissed the shawl. The Ripper case has always attracted fakes, letters supposedly written by the killer, knives supposedly used in the murders, bricks supposedly pulled from walls he leaned against. An entire industry of Ripper memorabilia sprang up around a case that never had a confirmed suspect. And most of it was nonsense sold to people desperate for a piece of the mystery. So this shawl, with its unverifiable backstory and no official record, got filed away in most experts' minds as just more of that same junk. That changed in 2007 when the shawl came up for sale at auction. A writer and self-described amateur investigator named Russell Edwards bought it. He was not a scientist, and he was not a police officer, just someone who had spent years pulled into the Ripper mystery the way so many people are, and who had the money and the determination to actually try to prove whether this object was real. Where other collectors before him had seen a moth-eaten scrap of old cloth, Edwards saw a potential time capsule, something that might still be carrying secrets from that night in Mitre Square if the right kind of science was pointed at it. That science came from a researcher named Dr. Jari Louhelainen, a molecular biologist who specialized in exactly this kind of impossible task, pulling usable genetic material out of samples that were old, damaged, and handled by countless people over the years. The odds were not good. This shawl had spent over a century being folded, unfolded, stored in drawers, exposed to damp English weather, touched by relative after relative. Every single one of those years and every single one of those hands worked against the survival of any clean genetic evidence. DNA breaks down with time, with moisture, with light, and it gets mixed with the DNA of everyone who has ever handled the object. Getting anything reliable out of this cloth should have been close to impossible. But Louhelainen's team did not go after the ordinary kind of DNA most people think of, the type found in the nucleus of a cell. That kind degrades fast, and there usually is not much of it left in a sample this old. Instead, they focused on something called mitochondrial DNA, a different and far tougher kind of genetic material found in the tiny energy-producing structures inside our cells. There is a huge advantage to using it in a case like this. Every cell carries hundreds, sometimes thousands of copies of mitochondrial DNA compared to just one set of nuclear DNA. So even in a badly degraded sample, there is a much better chance some usable trace survives. There's also something else special about mitochondrial DNA that made it perfect for bridging a gap of more than a century. It is passed down only through the mother's side. Not a mix of both parents, like regular DNA, just an unbroken line from mother to daughter, stretching back generation after generation. A son carries his mother's mitochondrial DNA his whole life, but he cannot pass it on to his own children. That means if you can find a living person today whose maternal line traces back to someone alive in 1888, their mitochondrial DNA should still closely match that ancestor's, even after well over 100 years. It becomes a kind of genetic thread connecting the present directly back to the Victorian-era. So the researchers had a plan, and the first step was proving the shawl itself was genuine, because if the object was fake, nothing else about the story would matter. They needed to find a living descendant of Catherine Eddowes, tracing an unbroken maternal line down through the generations using birth records, marriage records, and old parish registers. It took real genealogical detective work, but eventually they found her. A woman alive today with no idea that her own body carried a genetic signature reaching back to a murder victim from the age of gas lamps and horse-drawn carriages. She agreed to give a simple cheek swab. When the lab compared her mitochondrial DNA to material extracted from the darkest stains on the shawl, the sequences matched. Not a loose or partial resemblance, a genuine match consistent with direct maternal lineage. That single result changed everything, because it meant the shawl was not just another fake trophy sold to gullible collectors. It really had been present that night. It really had picked up the blood of a woman who, only minutes earlier, had been alive and walking those same dark streets hoping to scrape together enough money for a bed. Once that was established, the team moved on to what everyone actually wanted to know. Was there anything else on that shawl? When they examined it more closely, they reported finding a second biological trace mixed in with the blood, one consistent with semen. If that was accurate, it meant the killer might have left behind a piece of his own biology on the very cloth that fell near his victim's body, a genetic signature waiting untouched through the reigns of 6 different British monarchs for someone with the tools to finally read it. The researchers isolated that second trace and pulled its mitochondrial DNA as well. Mitochondrial DNA cannot give you a face or a name on its own, but it gives you a signature that can be compared against a real person. And the person they chose to compare it against was not some random name pulled from the pile of 100 old theories. It was a man who had already been sitting near the top of the original 1888 police suspect list, a man whose name barely means anything to the public today, because his story never had the glamour that people wanted from their killer. His name was Eddowes Kosminski, a 23-year-old Polish-Jewish immigrant working as a barber in the middle of Whitechapel, in the exact neighborhood where the murders happened. He had fled Poland, then part of the Russian Empire, to escape the violent anti-Jewish riots sweeping through the region at the time, hoping to build a safer life in London. Instead, he found poverty, cramped housing, and a city that offered little support for someone struggling the way he was. According to accounts from people who knew him, his mental health began breaking down badly in the years around the murders, with symptoms that modern doctors would likely describe as paranoid schizophrenia, including reports of him hearing voices and refusing food because he believed it was being poisoned. Police records from the time describe him as someone with a strong hatred toward women and dangerous tendencies, notes that were written down while the investigation was still active, not added later to fit a theory after the fact. None of that makes him the kind of suspect anyone wanted at the time. He was not wealthy, not connected, not the sort of name that would sell a scandalous headline. He was simply a struggling immigrant living in poverty in the exact area where women were being murdered, which is part of why his name faded into the background of Ripper history for so long, while flashier theories about princes and secret societies dominated public imagination instead. Researchers once again went hunting for a living maternal descendant, this time connected to Kosminski's family line, and eventually found a woman willing to provide a sample. Her mitochondrial DNA was compared against the second stain on the shawl, and according to the team, it matched. After more than 130 years, the science appeared to point directly at a man the police already suspected while the murders were still happening. And that is genuinely the most unsettling part of this whole story. This was not some secret nobody in authority ever considered. A senior police official named Melville McNagden wrote a private memo in 1894 naming Kosminski as one of his top 3 suspects, describing him as having a strong homicidal tendency and a hatred of women. Even more striking, the chief inspector who ran the entire Ripper investigation, a man named Donald Swanson, apparently wrote a private note years later in the margin of his own copy of a colleague's memoirs, all but confirming that he personally believed Kosminski was the killer. That note was never meant to be seen by the public. It sat hidden in a book for decades. Kosminski was eventually committed to an asylum in 1891 after his family could no longer manage his condition, and he remained institutionalized until his death. Here's the detail that tends to stick with people the longest. The murders in Whitechapel stopped almost exactly around the time he was taken off the streets. No pattern like that continued afterward. No comparable wave of killings picked up again in that part of London once he was gone. Now, is this actually the end of the story? Not quite, and it is important to say that clearly because good journalism means giving you the doubts along with the discovery. This DNA evidence has been challenged hard by scientists and historians alike, and the criticism is not just noise from people who refuse to accept an answer. The biggest problem is the shawl's own history. It passed through the hands of a police officer, then his family, then generations of relatives, then an auction house, then a private buyer, then a modern laboratory, all without ever being sealed or protected the way real forensic evidence should be. That means it was touched, folded, and breathed on by dozens of people across more than 100 years, and any one of them could theoretically be the source of contamination rather than the actual killer. Even Lou Halanen himself, the scientist who led the original testing, has since acknowledged publicly that the chain of custody for this object was broken, and that parts of the earlier analysis had weaknesses. Some critics have gone even further, pointing out that Kosminski's job as a barber in Whitechapel meant he could plausibly have had innocent physical contact with Eddowes or other women in that neighborhood at some point, since barbers of that era sometimes did more informal grooming work, which means DNA transfer alone does not automatically prove he committed murder, rather than simply having lived and worked nearby. There's also the simple mathematical problem that mitochondrial DNA is not unique to one single person the way full nuclear DNA profiling is. It is shared by everyone descended from the same maternal line. which could stretch across many hundreds or even thousands of people alive in London at that time. A match tells you the sample likely came from someone in that specific maternal family group, not that it definitely came from one particular man in that group. Combine that with over a century of uncontrolled handling, and you can understand why some forensic scientists remain cautious even while others are convinced the overall picture, including the historical police suspicion, the living location, the documented mental state, and the timing of his institutionalization, adds up to more than coincidence. What makes this story even more current right now is that it has not stayed quiet. Descendants of both Catherine Eddowes and Eddowes and Kosminski have recently come together, which is a strange and almost unbelievable alliance considering one family lost an ancestor to murder, and the other had an ancestor accused of committing it. Together, they have been pushing for Britain's legal system to reopen the inquest into Eddowes' death, hoping that a modern court could formally weigh the DNA evidence in a way the original 1888 investigation never had the tools to do. Their argument is simple. If the science really is strong enough, then closing this case properly would finally give some kind of formal justice to the victims, rather than leaving history to argue about it forever in books and documentaries. Whether that legal effort succeeds is still an open question, and it may take years to resolve if it resolves at all. Cold cases like this rarely close in a single clean moment. But the fact that a serious legal push is happening right now, more than a century after the murders, shows just how far this case has come from being pure folklore. It has moved from campfire story to something being argued over with genetic science in modern courtrooms. Step back and look at the full shape of this case for a moment. For most of its existence, the Ripper mystery survived because people needed the killer to be someone extraordinary. A prince, a genius, a secret society acting on royal orders. The truth that this DNA evidence points toward is almost the opposite of that fantasy. An ordinary, mentally unwell, desperately poor immigrant living in the very streets where he allegedly hunted. Someone the police were already quietly watching before the killings even ended. If true, that is a far darker kind of horror than any conspiracy theory, because it means evil did not need to be special or powerful. It could simply be a neighbor nobody paid close enough attention to until it was too late. So here is where it stands today. A shawl once thrown away by history as worthless junk has been tested using tools the Victorian police could never have dreamed of. And the results, according to the scientists who ran them, point to a name that was hiding in plain sight the entire time. Descendants of the victim and the accused have joined forces to ask the British legal system to finally settle the question properly. And yet, because of contamination risks and a shaky chain of custody, plenty of serious experts still refuse to call this case closed. So I want to know what you think. Does this finally feel like the answer? An ordinary, troubled local man exposed by science more than a century after he slipped through the cracks? Or do you think that shawl has passed through too many hands to ever be trusted and the real killer's identity is still out there, lost somewhere in the fog? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one.